Zelensky.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're just gonna, I have some questions for Simon, and then we can open it up, well, quickly, since we're such a small group. It was pretty competitive with the weather.
Mhm.
You can understand. So, Simon, my first question is, how did you get into journalism?
Yeah, I guess I got into it through writing fiction very unsuccessfully.
I didn't know this about you.
Yes. I started out trying to write short stories, was a terrible failure. And then my girlfriend at the time in college was like, well, if you like writing so much, why don't you write for the college newspaper? So I tried that and very quickly fell in love with it. You know, it's you get this ability to barge into unfamiliar spaces and ask the questions you want, and everybody has to let you in and talk to you and take you seriously, and then you get to write about it. So you're still close to the written word and the writing process. Even if you're bad at it, you have the ability to hone that skill in a more forgiving atmosphere, I think, than fiction writing. So and then it was a question of how to do that. I tried to do it. I went to undergrad in Stanford, so I was writing for the Stanford Daily, and then I knew I wanted to go into journalism. And I understood, you know, pretty immediately that my language skills would be my competitive advantage. So I also was born in the Soviet Union, in a suburb of Moscow, and my family immigrated when I was 6 years old to the United States. So I grew up in San Francisco. I grew up speaking Russian at home. So that was pretty clear to me. And I had family still in Moscow and some family friends in Moscow who would have kind of helped me get oriented. It really reminds me of Terrible Country, a fantastic book. Keith Gessen. Yes, the kind of, you know, having that, my grandmother actually is still 91 years young, still there, still sharp as a tack. So I first tried to get some experience in journalism in California, and everybody was like, you have no experience, so we can't give you any experience. Now, I remember there was one newspaper I applied for a job at, the Lodi News Sentinel. This is a little town, Lodi, California, that has more cows than people, and there's like some wine growing and stuff. Anyway, the guy was like, you know, you seem fine, but you have no experience. Where are your clips? And I was like, well, I got these college paper clips. And he's like, well, that doesn't count. So anyway, I was very bummed. For about 6 months, I was looking for a job, hoping to build up clips to apply for the newspaper of my dreams, which was the Moscow Times. It's an English language newspaper in Moscow. It has been a kind of training ground for a lot of correspondents that I really admire. Carletta Gall comes to mind, now of the New York Times, but she started out there. War correspondent. So while I was on this, you know, job hunt in places like Lodi, California, the Moscow Times posted a job listing for a business correspondent. I had no experience in that, but I was like, okay, I'll just write the guy, at least he'll like know my name, the editor-in-chief. So I wrote him an email in response to this posting, and the job interview on the phone very quickly lasted about 10 seconds. He just asked me, do you speak Russian? And I said, yes, I do. And he said, okay, move to Moscow, we'll teach you the rest. So I had no, you know, unlike a lot of the people here, I didn't study journalism. I then told my parents, nah, I'm moving to Moscow. And we took all this effort to get you out of there. Now you're moving back to what are you doing? You know, but they were pretty supportive. It's all right. They weren't particularly upset, especially because, as I said, we had family there. So there was kind of, they had people who'd watch over me once I landed. So I started at the Moscow Times, and then, long story short, I kind of moved on from there. They had me covering the stock market. I was writing a stock market column about the Moscow Stock Exchange at first. And absolutely no idea how a stock market works, but somehow, you know, you figure it out. And then I moved on from there to Reuters, then the Associated Press, then went freelance. This is, you know, kind of fast forwarding here a few years. Went freelance, just selling articles to various American magazines. And Time magazine paid the most for an online piece by some margin. So it was possible to survive on the number of stories that they bought and the amount of money they paid for them at the time. I don't think this is true anymore. Actually, I'm quite sure it's not. But yeah, over time they sort of said, okay, you know, he's producing. We might as well give him some kind of stringer contract. And that's what they did, and I kind of parlayed that into a staff job a few years later, and here I am.
Okay.
That's how it went.
So let's talk about Zelensky. When did you
Yeah.
when did you first meet him?
Yeah, really fast forwarding. I met him in 2019. By that point, I was already banned from entering Russia for a few years. And that ban, which was imposed in 2015 for journalism, forced me to focus even more intently on covering Ukraine for time. I was then based in Berlin, but sort of looking east. And the election season rolled around in Ukraine. I covered Ukrainian politics quite intensively. I pitched a story about those elections, and the pitch was related to the two main candidates who were then not Zelensky. It was Yulia Tymoshenko and the incumbent Poroshenko. But then while I was working on the story, this comedian starts climbing in the polls. So I told my editor we should probably include him in the story because he might win. So I got in touch with his team. These were mostly comedians, actors. It was not hard to get to Zelensky at the time because he wasn't getting a lot of requests from international media. And they invited me in, and I spent some time with them on the campaign trail, attended his comedy shows, which were sort of campaign rallies and comedy shows at the same time. They were difficult to distinguish between the two. So I met him on the campaign trail and interviewed him there, wrote a profile of him. By the time I was finishing the piece, he was ahead in the polls. So it was he kind of swallowed up that story. And then when he won, I stayed in close touch with him and his team, while reporting on Ukrainian politics and the war.
I've been watching Servant of the People.
Yeah, show first season. It's good.
Great show. This is the Zelensky show in which he plays a man who accidentally becomes president of Ukraine. And you write in the book, you're like, a lot of Ukrainians thought that that's who he was, right? When they were voting for him, like he had sold this image. How different was he actually? And you also write in the book about how he's changed, the war has changed him, but how different was he from that character that he played when you first met him?
He was similar in the sense of being this kind of, naive, kind of a person who's quite, he knew about politics because he was a political satirist, so he knew enough about politics certainly to make fun of the politicians. Mm-hmm. But yeah, he had quite a lot in common. I think he, with the character he played in the TV show, I think that character says a lot about the way that he imagined himself in the role of president. I think it allowed him to take this idea over time more and more seriously because he was, participating in the script writing process where he was writing himself into the role of president. And it was that character in the TV show, like Zelensky in real life, was a total outsider to politics who comes in promising to kind of clean out corruption and is sort of, trying to get his bearings among the clans and oligarchs who control Ukrainian politics, trying to find his footing in this environment and to reform it, to make it more honest, open, democratic, and not corrupt. I think those things are in parallel. Yeah, I think generally similar character. Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of easygoing, happy-go-lucky, very optimistic, and a little bit, frazzled at the challenges of the job once he was in it. That is true both of the character he played on television and indeed in real life when he became president. He was quite stunned by the ugliness of the political process.
Yeah. One of the things that he was, that in retrospect we think of as naive, but at the time was kind of hopeful, was that he thought he could find some way of talking to Putin that would, end the war in the East, right? And kind of bring this whole conflict, to a conclusion of some
Yeah.
kind. And what's your kind of, how do you read what happened basically between Zelensky's election and February 2022? Like, what's your kind of, how would you tell that story?
It's a long one, yeah. The book probably devotes a good 100
Yeah.
pages to that.
I mean, was he wrong? Like, was there nothing that he could have offered or at that point, was there an approach to Putin that would have been successful?
The short answer is
Yeah.
I don't think so. I
Uh-huh.
don't spend a lot of time, really any time in the book, kind of imagining hypothetical scenarios. What if this, then that.
Mhm.
But certainly when he took office, his main promise was to end the war in the Donbass in East Ukraine that had been raging at that point for 5 years about. And he came in promising to end this war, to find some agreement with Putin that would not be that would be acceptable to the Russians, but not humiliating for the Ukrainians, to find that space. And he did early in his tenure, in the first year or so, make some dramatic concessions. And I met with him and talked to him about a month before his first talks with Putin. He was preparing very intensively. He was going back and reading the minutes of previous negotiation rounds and trying to understand what went wrong. What is it that that was not allowing the two sides to find some kind of accommodation. I think also he generally has a very deep confidence in his own abilities as a communicator. It's a very, very Zelensky thing to do, to say in any situation, like, let's just sit down and just talk through it, talk it out. I want to look him in the eyes. I want to see what's your problem, what's going on. And he does believe quite strongly, I think, with some justification, in his own charisma, his own abilities as a negotiator, his own ability to charm people. And he did think that he would have some success in doing that with Putin. I talked to, those were closed talks, but I talked to several members of the Ukrainian delegation who described what it was like. And he did, one thing he did is he switched almost immediately to the Russian language, which is unusual. Usually in such high-level negotiations, each side speaks their native language. And at the table, you had Putin, Zelensky, and the two mediators, Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron. But Zelensky switched into Russian. Merkel speaks fluent Russian. Macron was a little bit lost because he had to rely on the simultaneous translation. And Zelensky did make a joke to try to break the ice with Putin, and more generally or more substantively, he was prepared to offer various kind of concessions or show flexibility on points that his predecessor had not shown any flexibility in, especially on the question of Ukraine's neutrality or its course toward joining NATO. And also various points in the kind of peace agreements that existed between Russia and Ukraine, the Minsk agreements. Zelensky showed a great deal of willingness to meet the Russians halfway, or at least find some way to implement this roadmap to peace. But Putin really wasn't having it. He was very icy, very dismissive in the talks. And I think that first negotiation wasn't the end of the road. They did then begin a process where lower level negotiators did try to come to some agreement. And I talked to several of them. And they said it was pretty clear early on, within a few months, that there just was no way to find that common ground. The Russians were not willing to give, very crucially, on the question of pulling their forces out of eastern Ukraine, or somehow demilitarizing that area, or giving control of the border to the Ukrainians, something like that. That the Ukrainians, I think rightly insisted that before we begin a kind of political normalization of this region and begin reintegrating them into Ukraine, which was a stated goal of the Russians as well, this region should remain a part of Ukraine, that the Russians need to pull their forces out. So that's one thing that there was no movement on that. I don't want to get too much into the nitty-gritty, but that is where things kind of stopped. And once they stopped, Zelensky, I'd say in the final year before the invasion, so leading up to the year before February 2022, he got quite tough on. So he took a different approach. He said we need to deter the Russians from attacking us. Rather than negotiating with them, we need to kind of show our strength. So that was clear in various kind of military postures, and in a major crackdown that I describe in the book on Russian propaganda channels inside Ukraine that Putin used to kind of win hearts and minds among the Ukrainian population. Zelensky cracked down on those and angered Putin very much. And that clash over the propaganda, Russian propaganda channels and Russian kind of political proxies really gets us right up to the point of the invasion when Putin was like, that's it, and he brought forces to the border.
I wonder if you would hazard, I mean, the shutting of TV stations, right, which I think partly from your book, other sources, I mean, that was one of the kind of things that led to war, right? And I'm curious what you think for an American, right? You're like, oh, you can't shut down someone's TV stations, right? They should have freedom of speech. From Zelensky's perspective, those TV stations were, spewing the propaganda of, a nation that was occupying Ukrainian territory, right? So we don't let ISIS, have TV channels, in New York City, right? So, what is your perspective on that?
Well, it took me a long time to kind of understand Zelensky's decision to do that. It wasn't obviously clear to me. He did get criticism right out of the gate from the European Union and some free speech and NGOs and activists who said, this is not kosher. You can't shut down TV channels, even if you strongly disagree with their where they're coming from. Indeed, one of Zelensky's closest allies and old friends, who was then the Speaker of the Parliament, told the president, "This is illegal. You can't do this. This is unconstitutional, and you have to find some other way." Zelensky disagreed. I think basically he saw it as imperial conquest of Ukraine by other means. These propaganda channels, and not only the channels, but the political parties inside Ukraine who were loyal to Moscow. He saw them, as he put it to me in one interview, as devils who were essentially undermining Ukrainian sovereignty. I talked to him about this a lot, more than one occasion, and I think over the course of the book, you sort of see where he's coming from. But honestly, looking back, that is, in my mind, one of the more controversial decisions, certainly, if not the most controversial. It certainly infuriated Putin. The decision not only to shut down those channels, but then to essentially behead the political party that they represented, this pro-Russian political party. So these kinds of political spats, political fights that were playing out in the Ukrainian political arena are very important to understand if you want to understand how we got to the invasion. So I spend a lot of time, explaining them in the book. I don't. If your question is who was right, I present kind of what happened and what were the arguments and motivations on both sides. I don't really take a position. I understand where Zelensky was coming from in making that decision, and I think history will be the judge, and the Ukrainian people will be the judge. But I don't really. I try not to come down on one side or the other.
And so you were in Kyiv just before the invasion. I read the book a couple months ago, but so you were there. I mean, you spent a lot of time with Zelensky in the first, like, pretty early on, right? Can you talk about just the time you spent with him and what you observed and kind of how the things that you were impressed by and things you were worried by?
Oh yeah, I mean, so I went to the front with Zelensky for the first time into the war zone about a year before the invasion started. We went to the Donbass together, and he seemed very, at that point there were tens of thousands, as many as 100,000 Russian troops already standing at the border, and already the Americans and Europeans were like, "What's going on here? What is Putin trying to tell us. And Zelensky seemed very dismissive of the idea that invasion was possible. He thought this was all bluster and an attempt to extract concessions from the West. Not even so much the Ukrainians, but the Americans, to get Biden to agree to some kind of Yalta conference style carving up of Europe into spheres of influence. I mean, this is Putin's wet dream. Like, he wants to sit down with China and America and be like, okay, you got this continent and this one's ours, and it's kind of how he thinks. Anyway, not to ramble too much here. At that point, Zelensky seemed very dismissive of the idea. I was a bit more concerned, but once the invasion was approaching, remember there was this period, certainly January, February 2022, where everybody was like, is this a bluff? Is this going to happen? Is it not going to happen? The Americans were saying it's going to happen on this day. A lot of the intelligence services and military analysts were like, you don't bring this many troops to the border unless you're serious about invading. And then there were guys like me, who were kind of subject matter experts or regional experts or experts in sort of Putin's style of operating. Generally, the consensus among that latter group, also my belief, is that this is not, Putin wouldn't do this. This is too risky. It's too much. He tends more to bring things to the brink than step away. He doesn't sort of put all his chips in all at once and without some way out. And it was clear to me that if the tanks rolled and he started to invade the entire country, like that's it. There's no way back from that. It would be extremely bloody. The Ukrainians would fight back very hard. Anyway, for all these reasons, I didn't believe the invasion was happening. So I was quite aligned with Zelensky at that point, actually. He also, for similar reasons, didn't believe that the invasion would happen. And because of that, I was not in Ukraine when the invasion started. I was on holiday in California because I was so convinced that the invasion would not happen that I was like, told my bosses, like, stop it. Because I was reporting up right up, until the kind of point when it just got tiresome to hear these debates. And then I took a break, and then the invasion started while I was on break. So I cut my vacation short and very quickly returned to Ukraine. But it was only in early April, so about 2 months, a little less than 2 months into the invasion, that I was able to begin reporting or doing the kind of reporting that you need for the book I wrote. Before that, Zelensky was living in a bunker under the presidential compound with his aides. They did not come out very often. He would come out to film one of the famous videos or to show that he remained at his post, but generally they were in the bunker, so I couldn't physically get the access that I needed to report on his administration the way I hoped to. But once the Russians were kicked out of the Kyiv region and they retreated they gave up on the idea of trying to capture the capital, Zelensky and his team began working in early April in their normal offices in the presidential compound, and I met with the president and talked to him about this idea. We had an interview, and I proposed the idea of me kind of writing a book about his experience of the war and his team's response to it and so on. And he was like, sure. Yeah, he wasn't particularly enthusiastic, but he was like, okay, yeah, if you want to hang around here, go for it.
And you read about how his belief in communication was borne out in this moment, right? Where the book is called The Showman, right? But not in a negative way. Like his job was to bring the gravity of the war to his counterparts in Europe and the US, right? You talk about
I mean, to grab not only the leaders of the Western world, but all of us. He saw his audience in those early days and weeks of the invasion, and in this way, I think he stood out from a more typical statesman or diplomat. He wasn't only talking to his peers; he was talking to everyone. He really wanted to communicate with the world and to win over. And this wasn't something he thought of on the fly. This was a conscious kind of communication strategy that he and his team came up with and thought about and talked to me about afterwards. They wanted to inspire the people in democratic countries around the world so that those people help from the bottom up to create pressure on their political leaders to support Ukraine. So not only to ask the leaders, but to ask the public to kind of create grassroots support for Ukraine. And in that endeavor, his showmanship was extremely important. He understood very well, how to make an emotional appeal. He understood the power of social media, of television, screenwriting, script writing, speech making, and his showmanship that we all saw him sort of fully formed. Not all of us, but I think most of the world saw him in this green t-shirted guise on the screens of our phones or our televisions, and fully formed as a character was quite enthralling and interesting to watch. And you find yourself rooting for him. This was the strategy that he and his team developed and put into practice. And I try to show in the book that his skills as an actor, as a communicator, as a showman, for 20 years before he went into politics, turned out to be extremely useful to him in keeping us all engaged, keeping our attention, and keeping our support.
One thing that in the book, there's a lot of really great detail about it, but in the end, I wasn't quite sure what your position was on what happened exactly in April, March and April with the negotiations with the Russians. What's your?
Yeah, there was just, I think today, a big story in Foreign Affairs that came out, again, rekindling this debate. So there were negotiations between Zelensky's team and a delegation of Russian negotiators. It started at the end of February, so really 5 days or so after the start of the invasion. And then continued until the middle of April, and they were negotiating, trying to find a negotiated solution, a negotiated end to the war. So people have been kind of debating ever since about what happened there, what were these negotiations about, and what led them to break down. So I do sort of describe those events in the book. I was in the pretty unique and privileged position of being there as these things were happening. So I was talking to the negotiators as they were, like, the day that they had a negotiating round, I would then have a call with one of them or meet one of them and talk about what was going on. And so from those conversations, the revelations of Russian war crimes in Bucha were an extremely important factor. And it actually caused most of Zelensky's team to say to Zelensky, we have to stop talking to these monsters. They're committing genocide against our people. We have to stop the negotiations. And to my surprise, in talking to these people, I learned that Zelensky said, no, we have to continue with these negotiations, even though we recognize this as a genocide. We recognize what they're doing. We see what they're doing. We want to get revenge. We want them to face justice, but we still need to push through with these negotiations to end the war. And this went on for some time. So that's one big factor of why they eventually broke down, because within his team, the emotional reaction to the atrocities was understandably very intense, and they found it repulsive to sit across the table from the Russians. The other factor that was clear to me at the time from talking to the participants was that right around that time, Ukraine achieved a number of very important and inspiring victories. So first one is they won the Battle of Kyiv, very crucially. So the Russians didn't just kind of give up as a goodwill gesture on the idea of taking the capital. They got their butts handed to them, and they had to pull back. They lost the Battle of Kyiv. So that was a sign, a big sign to Zelensky that, hey, maybe we have a chance here. At the same time, this really within days, all these events happened within a matter of about 10 days. They famously sank Russia's flagship in the Black Sea, the Moskva. It's a big boost to morale. They shot it with 2 torpedoes. The thing sank. Incredible humiliation to the Russians. And they arrested Putin's best friend and proxy in Ukraine, Viktor Medvedchuk. Also a massive victory, and there was just a lot of jubilation in Zelensky's team when that happened. all these things combined, I was talking to people as this was happening, they were describing a kind of an inner strength that woke up inside Zelensky and many on his team that led him to say, maybe we can win this thing on the battlefield. Let's see how far we can push on the battlefield, how much territory we can get back through by military means, especially as at that point also a crucial factor, Western military aid began arriving in much greater numbers. So it took a few weeks for the Western allies to kind of get their affairs in order and begin really shipping weapons. Those began arriving. So all those factors kind of combined to hurt those talks. I mean, I think to make those talks less interesting, say, for the Ukrainians. So revulsion at the war crimes and the idea that we're winning on the battlefield, let's keep the momentum and then negotiate from a position of greater strength later on.
Has Zelensky made mistakes? And
Yeah, I mean, sure. Mistake number one is also the mistake I made. Is not foreseeing the invasion. I mean, I think he certainly carries a greater share of the blame because he was getting, he was making the decisions that mattered in terms of preparations. I think that's something that he has not fully faced the reckoning over that miscalculation of not foreseeing the scale of the invasion. He thought there would be an escalation in fighting in the east. That was sort of the scenario at the front of his mind. He did not believe that there would be this full-scale invasion. And many Ukrainians you talk to there remember that. And people in the military say, why did we lose these territories so quickly? Why didn't we have stronger defenses in those areas to prevent the Russians from sweeping in from the south? These kinds of questions are still there. And I think that's the mistake that sooner or later Zelensky and the leadership will have to answer for in some kind of democratic process or more open debate. So far, what I've seen is there has been some discussion of this, in the Ukrainian leadership and with the public, but generally the position is like, we're fighting a war here. We're in the middle of a war. Let's not start playing the blame game and all of that. So I think that answering for that mistake is still yet to come. That's the big one. Yeah, when I asked Zelensky this question when we last spoke, this was October of last year, so about 6 months ago now. He said he didn't have any strong regrets. He said maybe some things in kind of the personnel department, people that he trusted and hired that he maybe shouldn't have let so close. But yeah, kind of on big picture questions, he said he had no regrets.
I was, and this is both in the book and also in some articles that you've written for Time. And I wonder, you say you have talked to him in 6 months. Is that because he doesn't want to talk to you?
No, I mean, maybe he doesn't. I don't know. I haven't gotten his review of the book. It's because the publication of the book and then the promotion of the book took about 6 months. I just really finished the book tour in the end of March. So, yeah.
But what I was going to say, I mean, I was so impressed by the fact, the book is quite sympathetic. But we are in this information environment where, an information environment that I understand, where people take criticism of Ukraine very much to heart. Like, how can you criticize, Ukraine? How can you criticize Zelensky at this moment when they are, through no fault of their own, being, attacked and massacred by the Russian army? So how did you kind of, plus you had, on top of that, you had a lot of access to Zelensky, which tends to make a person more sympathetic to their source than otherwise, right? So how did you kind of balance, I assume you would like Ukraine to win the war, right? Versus, trying to be kind of clear-eyed about what you were seeing and the various stories that emerge, and I feel like you can really pull your punches. How did you just kind of?
Yeah, it's just the principle, and it's been hammered into me, and I'm very grateful to my editor for this. He's really, keeps me honest on this point that if you find yourself trading access for your objectivity, if you sort of are looking at a text or thinking about writing a text, and you're like, this is going to hurt my access, that's out of bounds. You cannot do that. So, and my editor has taught me over the years working with him that, even if it does cost you the access, being honest and calling it as you see it, and telling the story as the reporting guides you, will help you in the long term. Establish the credibility and trust with the sources that you want to speak to. So just never allow access to factor in when you're making an important decision about what to cover, how to describe it. Don't pull punches to save your access. I think that's the kind of guiding principle that I've tried my best to follow, and the one that has got me into trouble, at least among many readers in Ukraine and many Ukraine supporters, because when in periods in the war when things were looking very grim for the Ukrainians, such as the moment when the counteroffensive of last summer and early fall was failing, I wrote about that quite harshly. I also wrote about problems with corruption, and how the Americans were really pushing Zelensky to fight the war against corruption while also fighting the war against the Russians, and how difficult this was, and what the issues were there. I think a lot of readers also, found that as kind of like, what are you, whose side are you on? And that's also kind of a question that you have to think about. So as a journalist, yes, I want Ukraine to win this war. This is a genocidal act of aggression. There's no question in my mind. There's no both sides in this war. This is just a horrific violation of international law unfolding before our eyes. But there's this tendency during a war to see everything and everyone as black and white, with us or against us, and in that respect, you have to call it like it is. Just be honest with the reporting and with what you hear, what you see, and not try to please any camp. Even the people fighting the war. I mean, if they're struggling, you have to say they're struggling. You can't see them struggling and hear them tell you we're fucking struggling, and then write a story about everything's going great. That's not your job. That's the job of a propaganda person, and they have those. There's television, propaganda in Ukraine and in Russia that delivers that kind of message among Ukrainians. That often earns a lot of scorn and frustration. That kind of, jingoistic rhetoric that they often see on their own TV channels. That's not my job. Whatever, raising morale or whitewashing things. That's out of bounds. And I am very sympathetic, and I respect the people who are upset by the picture that my article sometimes paints, because it hurts morale. I can understand that, but it's true.
Is there some questions?
Thanks so much for talking to us now. I have a question. In your book, you kind of show the process how Zelensky's identity underwent a transformation from nostalgia, for the Soviet past to revulsion against it. And, in a way, Zelensky's story, it's a story about, of the evolving sense of Ukrainian identity. And I know that you grew up, your father is basically from the region, so he grew up close to the town where Zelensky well, to Zelensky's hometown,
Mhm.
and your mother's from Russia. So my question would be, as you were writing the story, as you were working on this book, how did your sense of identity develop? Did you feel the Ukrainian identity were the Soviet component of your identity? What kind of transformation did that undergo, and the Russian component of that? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great question. And in that sense, I am very close to the story. You know, yeah, born in the Soviet Union, grew up watching Soviet movies with my parents. And it was one of the ways that for those who haven't read the book, one of the ways that I saw this transformation in Zelensky was his attitude toward the Soviet comedies that he would watch throughout his life. As a kind of family tradition, you watch the same comedies. And then once the invasion started, he found himself revolted by them, even though this shaped very much his own career as a comedian and his own attitudes and so on. But he couldn't watch these comedies. His perception of them and his internal world had changed so much that he found them revolting. About myself, I have to say that my habit, you know, my professional life forces me to kind of point the lens outward. I don't spend a lot of time on kind of internal reflection and analysis of myself. I guess the time for that will come. It comes out sometimes in conversation with friends and family and so on. You know, I feel certainly a deep urge out of respect for Ukraine's evolution as a nation and its growing strength, the growing strength of its national identity. I feel a real urge to learn Ukrainian, to become more fluent in Ukrainian. That's one thing. It's kind of a personal goal I've set for myself and something I'm working on. I mean, there's also professional reasons for that. It's harder and harder to work as a journalist in Ukraine with only Russian and English. Ukrainian is increasingly necessary. But also, I just feel, you know, out of respect to the story and the evolution of the country, that I need to master that. Yeah. Otherwise, I honestly don't do a lot of that kind of internal analysis of how I'm changing as a person. It's just not really a habit I have, and work doesn't really force me to do that. You know, I don't write about myself very much. I don't know. I'm sorry to disappoint you with such a superficial answer, but yeah, I guess time will tell. Maybe when I get to writing memoirs or something, I'll have to think more about that.
Right.
Thank you.
You have a view on as Zelensky's trying to root out corruption, his own staff in general. Is that coming from him really, or is that a lot of pressure coming from the United States? You have a view on that?
Yeah. I think it's coming from him, both sides. I mean, so the other big promise he made when he took office was to fight corruption. The first one was to end the war. The second one was to fight corruption. These were the two goals that he promised to fulfill as president. If you look at his record on corruption in the years before the full-scale invasion, it's pretty impressive. You know, it didn't get a lot of coverage internationally because it's kind of a domestic story. It was at the time anyway. But he took some very bold steps against high-level political corruption by going after the oligarchs who generally controlled political clans, controlled and paid members of parliament, and really dominated the political arena in Ukraine for many years. And he went after them really viciously with laws enacted and various, yeah, I mean, he went to war with them, politically speaking. And that was quite a bold and dangerous move in a country like Ukraine, where the wealthy really historically have an enormous amount of power. So I think it is coming from him. He, from what I've heard from his allies and members of the administration has a very, very visceral, emotional, and angry reaction when he is told of graft or corruption or someone enriching themselves or even kind of, using a company car for personal ends, things like that. It's like he really quickly flies off the handle when he hears about things like that. But anecdotally, I've heard that from his staff. But the other thing I should say on this, to the other part of your question about the American pressure, he also pushes back on the American pressure that has been coming down on him during the full-scale invasion. As the American financial and military support is ramped up to the tune of over $100 billion by now, well over, and hopefully more to come later this week, if Mike Johnson gets his act together. The Americans have really intensified their demands for reforms and good governance and oversight and so on to make sure that this money is not lost to corruption. And Zelensky is very sensitive to that. He's very intent on it. He sort of invites and welcomes, U.S. institutions and NGOs to kind of help monitor this money and so on. But he also says, and when I talked to him about this came through quite starkly, that it's a little bit unfair for the Americans to demand that we fight this war on the second front against corruption right now in the middle of the full-scale war for our survival against Russia, because a war against corruption internally saps a lot of resources, political capital. It's destabilizing for the elites. Members of the administration who have nothing to do with corruption find themselves needing to, give interviews to anti-corruption authorities and prosecutors and so on. When you're doing that house cleaning, it can be a distraction. It can be destabilizing for an administration in any country, anywhere. A war against corruption is a serious, big undertaking. And one point that he made to me in one of our conversations is that, we have to prioritize the war for our survival here against the Russians. Yes, we're fighting corruption, but please have some understanding for our position when, we can't afford to start purging entire ministries, especially, the defense ministry. There was a scandal that was in 2023 when the defense minister, Alexei Reznikov was fired, along with all his deputies, because of a series of corruption scandals. Zelensky went through with it, but he also wanted to give his defense minister Reznikov chances to clean house internally without needing to dismiss and then replace the entire leadership of the defense ministry. Imagine how destabilizing that is in a time of war. You need that team to function. And the problems that were happening there with corruption were on a fairly low level. They related to things like the skimming off the top and the purchase of winter coats to clothe soldiers or eggs to feed soldiers, things like that. We're not talking about billions of dollars disappearing into Swiss bank accounts. But so you see what I mean? So there's this tension that exists in Zelensky's mind too, of like, yes, we need to do everything we can to fight corruption now, but not at the expense of losing the war for our survival.
All right, Mr. Mayor, I work on Ukrainian politics and teach here. But not Zelensky, and I will buy your book, so if what I asked you is in the book, please let me know. I just wanted to ask, you lived there, so you've probably heard these alternative narratives coming from certain layer of Ukrainian society about how Zelensky is really just a tool of the Russians. And I wanted to ask you about if he's aware of those and how he reacts, and in your opinion, sort of on his relationship with Yermak, who's often seen as a pro-Russian actor, and also how he reacted to the stories about Kolomoisky funding and him just being a puppet of Kolomoisky prior to his election.
Yeah, take those separately. So the roots, in my understanding of the Russian puppet narrative, they really emerged when Zelensky was trying very hard to come to terms with Putin, and he was preparing for it was 2019. He was preparing for the negotiations with Putin. He was taking certain kind of trust building steps in 2019, such as pulling Ukrainian troops a little bit away from the contact line, or dismantling certain fortifications, or opening roads that would allow Ukrainian citizens who live in the occupied territories to come over to the other side and try to build some literal and figurative bridges between the two sides. Anyway, all of this, there was a pretty large, contingent in Ukrainian society, and certainly in the political class, that criticized Zelensky very harshly for such steps. They saw this as appeasement. They saw this as capitulation, and a lot of the people who were spreading these ideas that Zelensky was kind of playing on Putin's side, came from Zelensky's domestic political opponents, especially his predecessor, President Poroshenko. In the media and in society, you started seeing these stories, these rumors. They often had to do with not so much Zelensky, but his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak. At the point I'm describing, part of that time, Yermak was not yet chief of staff. In details, Yermak was the lead negotiator, sitting at the table across from the Russians. So Zelensky's political opponents were like, "This guy, he's shaking hands. Look, he's shaking hands with them. He's having phone calls with them. He's texting with the Russians. Yeah, no shit. He's negotiating. He's involved in like a serious negotiation." But that narrative of Yermak is a Russian stooge or something came out of that. And I talked to Yermak. I spent a lot of time with Yermak. I spent with his team. Talked about it, and they're like, "Yeah, that was frustrating. I mean, it was frustrating. What can you say? It's kind of politics. Yeah, I mean, it was infuriating, but it was also kind of a natural line of attack for Zelensky's political opponents to take, because they wanted to oust him from power, fundamentally. So that's what I'd say on that point. On Kolomoisky, it's an interesting story. So those who are not sort of so well versed in the intricacies of Ukrainian politics, Kolomoisky was a Ukrainian billionaire, very anti-Russian. He was actually, and still is, as I understand, wanted in Russia for war crimes. Anyway, it is a long and colorful story, and a very colorful, pretty nasty character. He owned the television channel where Zelensky's comedy was broadcast when Zelensky was a comedian. So when Zelensky made the decision to try running for president, he and his team came to Kolomoisky and said, "Will you help us? Will you work with us?" And Kolomoisky, who was at odds with the previous Ukrainian administration, was like, "Yeah, well, sure. I mean, it's in the interest of a wealthy person to back a sort of dark horse candidate for president. That's a pretty good proposition." And his TV channel became sympathetic to Zelensky during the election campaign. I think Kolomoisky expected to be repaid after Zelensky's victory with a great deal of political favor from Zelensky's administration. He was sorely disappointed. And Zelensky showed very early that, thanks, but I'm president now, you are a businessman, so I don't owe you anything. I mean, their relationship soured very, very quickly within months of Zelensky taking office, because Zelensky didn't sort of, bow before this man who had admittedly helped him win the elections. But Zelensky showed himself not to, he didn't deliver the things that Kolomoisky, the oligarch, wanted. And today, Kolomoisky, last I checked, is sitting in a jail in Kyiv. So because Kolomoisky clearly does not control Zelensky. If he ever did. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Masha. I work here on the magazine and podcast.
Hi.
My first question is, what can you say about Zelensky's relationship with Ukrainian journalists, even before the war? Like, there was, as far as I understand, he wasn't particularly friendly to independent media. So I'd love to hear your take on that. And then my other question is more general, just what was the most surprising thing to you while embedded with him? Having known him before and profiled him before, what was the most surprising to you about wartime Zelensky?
Yeah, the journalist question is a big one. And I spend quite a bit of time in the book kind of describing his administration from the perspective of Ukrainian journalists, and also end the book on a question of concern about that, after what I hope will be Ukraine's victory in the war, how will it return to a kind of an environment of free speech and open debate that it had before the war started? How difficult will that transition be for Zelensky? And I think it will be difficult. So when he took office, he was, by the accounts of his close advisors at the time, including his then chief of staff, Andrei Bogdan, extremely sensitive to criticism, to the point where they, as I described in the book, had to keep him away from Facebook and other social media because he would get very upset by anonymous commenters on his social media channels. There's a quote in the book from his then chief of staff who was like, the guy, it's like some anonymous account, no name account on Twitter, and he's losing sleep over it. He's on the phone with his mom. He's like, what are you doing? It's politics. So that was certainly something that he wasn't fully prepared for coming into politics. He entered politics when he entered the presidency. Before that, he was a beloved media figure, an entertainer. He was the most popular comedian in the country for many years. People loved him. When he talked to journalists, they would talk to him about his great movie and when's the next movie and like, how are you doing? And, tell us about your comedy and laugh. And, everything was hunky-dory. He comes into politics and it's not like that anymore. Very predictable thing, but it's something that he, I think, was quite naive about, and was very easily wounded when journalists began doing things like investigating his use of offshore bank accounts, looking at his finances in other ways, criticizing him, questioning him, investigating him journalistically. So his relationship was quite testy from the outset, and I think that he was frustrated also because they never had, as another close advisor of his complained to me, they never had a television channel that was nice to them. All the main television channels were owned by oligarchs. One of the main ones was owned by Zelensky's predecessor, who lost the elections to Zelensky and then used his television channel to attack Zelensky. Another big television channel was owned by the oligarch Kolomoisky. And when Kolomoisky didn't get the favors he wanted from Zelensky, then his television channel started attacking Zelensky. So they also saw a kind of oligarch dimension to this criticism. They saw journalists as kind of Ukrainian journalists, certainly, in the pocket of this or that oligarch. Because indeed, a large portion of the Ukrainian media environment is dominated by these wealthy businessmen. Was before the invasion. So yeah, it was very, very contentious. And then what we saw happen once the invasion was underway, and this was not something Zelensky did by decree, but under martial law, which kicks in once a nation is under full-scale attack, you impose martial law. It's kind of a formality. But under martial law, broadcast media are treated as critical infrastructure, and the state has the right to use them in the interest of national defense, to essentially wage the information war. And Zelensky and his team were quite comfortable doing that. I mean, Zelensky said, I'm going to use I'm paraphrasing, but every goddamn instrument I have to fight this war and win this war and keep this country alive. If that means taking control of the television channels, I'm going to do that because the law allows that. He wasn't breaking any laws. It's true. The martial law, he has that power. So that was an interesting dynamic. And in the early months, I think Ukrainian journalists were deferential to that reality, and also, kind of stopped muckraking and stopped criticizing him because to show deference to the head of state in a time of war. It's also kind of a natural reaction. But over time, they began criticizing him, and the tensions flared, and people began asking, including prominent journalists, when will we see some easing of the wartime restrictions on the media? And Zelensky wasn't having any of it and still is not having any of it. He said, we're still in a full-scale war, and now is not the time to criticize the head of state. So that's where things are. The question that I end the book on is, okay, just imagine what is the point at which Zelensky will say, okay, you're all free to criticize me again. And all the television channels go back to the oligarch ownership, and everyone can have at it. How easy will that be for him psychologically, politically, especially if you imagine the kind of condition Ukraine's economy will be in at that time? It will be very volatile, difficult, even in the best scenario, victory, total victory. The economy will be in a terrible state. You'll have millions of people coming back, refugees, coming back from abroad, coming home, needing support. You'll have at least 1 million military service personnel coming home and needing support. Politically, that's a very difficult environment, and for Zelensky in such an environment to say, on top of everything, and the media can now criticize me. I don't know. He says that is the course he is pursuing: win the war, lift martial law, go back to normal European democracy. But I think it will be in the event quite a lot messier. Was there a question that I forgot? No.
Yeah, what was surprising?
Oh, surprised me. I'm sorry, I rambled on so much about the media thing. Surprised me. Yeah, I mean the toughness he showed, the grit. Yeah, I didn't think he had it in him. No, I really didn't. The way he transformed into this kind of bulldog figure, there was no indication that he had that power, that steeliness that he has shown. And watching and observing that transformation and trying to understand it was very was fascinating and it's surprising. That's a very broad answer, because it happened over time. There were many kind of points along that trajectory, but yeah, that surprised me that he became this kind of Churchillian wartime leader out of something that really had none of the ingredients I could see.
Although when in the book you say people compare you to Churchill, and he's like, well, I prefer to be compared to Charlie Chaplin.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's really telling conversation I had with him. He didn't particularly like the comparisons to Churchill because, as I understood, Churchill was an imperialist, and Zelensky sees this war as fundamentally anti-imperialist. So he preferred Charlie Chaplin.
I saw him back there.
I was wondering, do you have plans with the evolving attitude towards collaborators and the extent to which looking for volunteer and collaborators is prioritized?
Yeah, fascinating question. Thank you. Yeah, it's a big one. And I did talk at length with him about this idea. So that really, that question comes to the fore when Ukraine retakes territory from the Russians. And the stated goal still of Zelensky and his leadership is to reconquer all Ukraine's occupied land, including Crimea and all of the Donbass. And when I talked to him about this, it was quite interesting how he seemed to have a pretty clear idea of the military dimension of that goal. You can the way he talked about it, you can kind of calculate how many tanks, how many weapons, how many airplanes it will take to win that military mission, to get back that territory. And his generals think about those things. Zelensky also has to think about the political dimension of that challenge. And there you have, the hearts and minds, winning back the support of people who remained in the occupied territories, in some cases engaged in some form of collaboration, but collaboration is a spectrum. There are people who continued, working as in sanitation services in an occupied city because they wanted to keep the pipes flowing. And they just kind of stayed and continued doing their job. Under a certain interpretation of Ukrainian law, that would also be seen as a collaboration. So I talked a lot to Zelensky about where he would draw those lines, how to go about it, and he had a much less clear idea of that than the military dimension, and that was interesting for me to observe. The Ukrainian government does devote a lot of time to thinking about this. There's a ministry in the Ukrainian government called the Ministry of Reintegration of Occupied Territories. So, and they I looked into this a little bit. They train counselors that come in, like, okay, first the military comes in, then the security services come in, and then at some point, sort of fourth wave of these counselors with, I don't know, like, notebooks and pension checks and I don't know what, it's a little vague to me as to what they would do, but to try to, welcome people back into the Ukrainian community and to some extent re-educate or show them that Ukraine has returned. And in the sense, I think to weed out collaborators, people who are not ready to see Ukraine as their home. But that's a very, very difficult challenge. It's one that he thinks about, but it worries him a lot, this idea. But so far, Ukraine has only had to deal with that problem in territories that were occupied for about 9 months. I'm thinking of the city of Kherson. And I actually talked to Zelensky about this in most detail right after we visited Kherson, right after its liberation, we went there, spent a day there, and then we're heading back and we were talking about this question. And it was like, yeah, those people were, under Russian occupation for 9 months. Imagine people who have been under Russian occupation for 10 years. And he said their boys are fighting against us. Their men have been recruited by the Russians to fight against Ukraine. And when they are killed in battle, when their bodies come home, the Russian side or their family members in occupied parts of Ukraine say, look what the Ukrainians did. Zelensky is very wise to this what that does to a society. So the question of collaboration, it sounds like it's pretty short, simple question, but it opens up an enormous Pandora's box of very, very difficult issues that Zelensky thinks a lot about and doesn't have a lot of good answers to.
When you were on vacation in California,
Yeah.
you a lot of things, and we were sure that the intervention was not possible.
Yeah.
I think that maybe in Kremlin they knew what to do. But what is your diagnosis? Why still they have started it? What is it? Kind of a diagnosis of one person, or maybe the system, or maybe some corruption, or I don't know what. So the first. Second, you said that you were trying to be balanced. Have Russians tried also to give you your kind of your piece of information of I don't know of their ideas, or have you tried to contact Russians other than propaganda people or people who were maybe journalists, etc.? So what was your attempt?
Yeah. So the first question. I defer usually on this question to my colleagues who study Putin more intensely, again, because I was kicked out of Russia in 2015. It's quite a handicap for me in my work. My sourcing and reporting in Moscow is not good. It's not enough to give you an accurate picture, but there are journalists who do this very well. So I mean, one example would be Mikhail Ziger has written a lot of analysis about what the hell happened to Putin, why he went all in this way, made this decision that Ziger and many of our colleagues agree is out of character. It's too big of a risk. It's a complicated question. I mean, some of you may have seen his writing on this. Some people Ziger points to the isolation that Putin was in during the pandemic. He was isolated and reading books of history that he now regurgitates to Tucker Carlson and so on. Yeah, at some point he I don't know. I don't want to go too much out on a limb on this because I don't see myself as an expert in Putin anymore, just because I haven't been there in almost 10 years. But yeah, he lost it at some point. So yes, I would say more directly to answer your question without going too far on a tangent, is that it is a diagnosis of one person. One person started this war. Yeah, it wasn't a collective decision. I think we saw that quite clearly in that famous meeting that Putin had a few days before the invasion, where he gathered the inner circle, the inner circle of the Kremlin, and they all looked like little bit, what's going on? What does he want us to say? What is he doing? What is this? You might remember this. The head of one of the heads of the intelligence services was sort of just totally flustered, didn't know what they were even talking about. Are we invading? Are we recognizing this territory as sovereign? You know, it's like, anyway, so that to that point. So about the kind of the question, it's a good question. So it goes back to the kind of, you know, where is it appropriate to have both sides? You know, I think, you know, in the book and in my reporting, I have talked to Russians. Crucially, from my understanding of their point of view, is this figure Viktor Medvedchuk, Putin's closest friend and ally in Ukraine.
You met him?
I met him. Yeah, I met him. I talked to him. Yeah, I interviewed him. I wrote a long profile of him for the magazine.
What is your opinion? Is it really no, is it really a solid person or a puppet or what?
Well, he represents the so he shares Putin's vision for what Ukraine should be like. It should be basically a loyal vassal state of Russia. But he wanted to, and to achieve that through political means, corruption, and propaganda. And he was, from what I understand, promising Putin, look, we don't need to attack Ukraine. We don't need a full-scale invasion. Give me 20, I'm just making up a number here, but $20 billion and 3 TV channels and an oil pipeline and whatever, some, you know, yeah, something else, and I will give you Ukraine. That was his proposition, but he failed in part because Zelensky then saw what he was doing and shut down his TV channels and took that oil pipeline and seized his assets and put Medvedchuk under house arrest. So then that political path to Russia colonizing or recolonizing Ukraine was shut, and then Russia reached for the hard power. That's basically the picture I got from really taking a hard look at Medvedchuk. You know, I also talked to a figure named Konstantin Zatulin, a very interesting imperialist kind of politician in Russia, one of the founders of Putin's political party. So yeah, I mean, I talked to him. I sort of tried to get their sense of where things are. To be honest, they're pretty direct. They don't hide their intent. If you talk to them, they say what they're doing. They talk about, you know, imperialism. And remember Zatulin, and this quote is in the book. He said, you know, yeah, either we get control of Ukraine through politics or we rip it apart. You know, so generally, my impression from speaking to Russian sources who were involved in these events is that they don't really hide what they're after, what they're doing. You kind of come down to it. So yeah, those voices are there in the book, and in my reporting. Yeah.
I wanted to thank you for being here, and it's
Thank you.
really fascinating. It's a little bit of a provocative question. Do you think Zelensky has spent himself as a great communicator, as Lee's shown? In other words, he gets credit for early things in the war. Maybe he gets some level of responsibility or blame for where we are right now. My impression is he's not really, or you'll tell me if I'm wrong, very popular domestically. At least when I visited Kyiv in January, I heard a lot of people complaining about him.
Mhm.
I feel like he's more popular abroad than domestically.
Mhm.
So maybe his charm, maybe his magic is no longer there domestically. And also abroad, he's obviously not getting the attention that he got the first months of the war. So is it the end of the road for the great community?
Yeah, it's a great question, and a deep one, and one I've discussed with him over the course of the invasion. And it surprised me, you know, looking back, how early he was aware of the problem of the human attention span. So when I talked to him, this was April 2022, about 2 months into the invasion. And he was then, a big part of our conversation was like, basically, he was describing how people are watching this war on Instagram. when they get sick of seeing the same images of blood and from the same country and the same emotions and the same stories and the same missile strikes, they will get bored and turn away. This is the way he was describing it. So he saw this, one thing, as creating a great sense of urgency in his diplomatic mission to win over the world and get the support as fast as possible, as much as possible, because the human attention span put him on a ticking clock. And that's not a criticism of him. It's more, I think, a sign of how we consume news, how we experience foreign tragedies. And he was very sensitive to this. He saw his audience as the world, but he also understood that the world is very far away. He needed to keep them as close as possible and engaged with him, his story, and this war for as long as possible. But he also was very aware of the time limit. And I think the way he would see it is that time limit exists for anyone. His challenge as a communicator and a showman, in many ways, was to extend it, to keep our attention, to give us new things to see, new reasons to believe, new reasons to think that Ukraine is winning, Ukraine can win, Ukraine needs our support. And he would think about this communication strategy on a kind of episode by episode timeline where we need, next week, we need a demonstration of victory to grab people's attention again, because we're losing people, we're losing their attention. And he said to me once that for us, attention equals support. So the last time we talked, and this is now fast forwarding a year and a half from that initial conversation I was just describing, he said that indeed fatigue with the war is rolling along like a wave across the United States and Europe, quote. And he said, another quote, people are acting like they're watching a rerun of the same show for the 10th time. And of course they want to change the channel. It's interesting that he uses the language of television still to describe his work and his communication strategy and how the world is responding to it. But that was, his diagnosis of the situation he's in now. Yes, the world, it's still the same war. The front line is not moving dramatically. The horrors and atrocities are continuing, but the way that you and I and everyone around the world is perceiving them feels similar on your, as he put it, Instagram feed. It's the same blood, the same country, the same emotions, and people start to turn away. So that is what he's seen over time. And his mission, and I think he's been very good at it, is to try to counter that phenomenon. He's done a better job at it than I think most leaders would, but it's kind of inevitable that sooner or later people change the channel. Last question.
Hi, my name is Laura. I'm an undergraduate student here. On this point of kind of like the waning of attention on Ukraine, and especially in terms of, you're mentioning Congress, they've been very slow to pass aid. What do you think is the role of journalists and journalism in the war effort for Ukraine?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. Yeah, and I mean this is it goes back to a question you asked, Keith, about people. My answer, people sort of see whose side are you on, this kind of question. And I think the way I thought about this when I was doing my reporting, I as a human being and as someone with Ukrainian roots, and my father's Ukrainian, and I have family in Odessa and so on, I wanted to help, but I had to make sure that help was in line with my professional obligations as a journalist. So when I talked to Zelensky about this, it was like, well, Simon, you again, as I said just a little earlier, attention equals support, right? So what journalists can do is keep telling the stories, keep the attention. They don't always have to be, good, uplifting, morale lifting stories. Not necessarily. I don't know, whatever. But just in keeping the focus on finding new ways to keep people interested. In that way, I think our journalistic goals to engage our readers, viewers, listeners, whatever, are actually aligned with Zelensky's goals as a communicator to keep his message going out into the world and keeping people engaged. That doesn't mean that we're on the same team, but in that way, I at least I felt some comfort in the fact that, okay, I am doing my best to get Ukraine's story out there. The book is a chronicle of the war. And taking off my kind of journalist hat for a minute and putting on my ethnic Russian, Ukrainian, yeah, whatever, a person who loves Ukraine very much. It gives me some hope and satisfaction that, you know, the book can remind people and take people back to those early days of the invasion when we were also enthralled and so enthusiastic in supporting Ukraine and watching this war and keeping and to remind people, you know, yes, now things may seem gloomy, but remember where we were 2 years ago, why this war seemed so important then, and why those arguments for supporting Ukraine are still very much alive today. That is the only way that I've been able to kind of marry the two. My kind of human desire to help Ukraine and my responsibility as a journalist to kind of tell stories truthfully. They're not always in conflict with each other. Sometimes they are aligned.
You're supposed to look at the question of the cake first.
Oh, no, let's hear that. We can do that privately. Simon Shuster, thank you so much for joining us. This is good.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Yeah, I want to sit down and grill all of you guys about what you do, what brought you into journalism. We'll be here all night. And are most of you guys studying